William Shakespeare never wore a watch, but he understood time better than most watch collectors ever will. The most important dive watch in history was named after one of his lines. A moon phase complication, it echoes his obsession with instability. Macbeth understood the psychology of the upgrade cycle. Hamlet diagnosed drift centuries before Quartz tried to correct it. We think horology measures seconds. Shakespeare knew it measures morality. This is not a literature lesson, it's a study of how watchmaking borrowed its deepest ideas from a playwright who never even seen a balance wheel. And once you see the link, you'll never be able to unsee it. Welcome back to Horological. Act 1, Depth. The Tempest in the 50 Fathoms. Blancpain named the first modern dive watch the 50 Fathoms. The name is poetic, not technical. It echoes the Tempest. Act 1, Scene 2. Full fathom 5, thy father lies. A fathom is a unit of depth, but Shakespeare was not measuring engineering tolerances. He was measuring burial, transformation, and submersion. The sea in the Tempest, it's not scenery, it is force. It changes what it touches. Blancpain's genius was not the rotating bezel alone, it was naming a dive instrument after verse. The original 50 Fathoms, it translated literary depth into mechanical depth. Today a Blancpain 50 Fathoms automatic sits in the wrist, an inky dial, a measured disciplined presence, surface from a dive wearing it, and the symbolism almost writes itself. We measure depth in metres now, yet we borrow the language of fathoms. Poetry survived the pressure test. Act 2, The Moon, A Midsummer Night's Dream in Lunar Time. If the Tempest is depth, A Midsummer Night's Dream is instability. The moon governs the entire play. Puck observes, the moon methinks looks with a watery eye. Under its influence lovers lose reason. Perception shifts. Reality bends. Historically tracking the moon mattered. For navigation, for agriculture, for tides, for ritual, before marine chronometers solved longitude, before satellites synchronised the globe, human beings looked upward. The Tudor 1926 moon phase, it tracks something we no longer need to track. And yet we do, because the moon is no longer about utility, it is about rhythm. A moon phase complication preserves an older relationship with time. When time was governed by orbit, not oscillation, Shakespeare understood lunar psychology, instability, transformation. The moon phase watch preserves that tension. We no longer need it, but we still want it. That is horology at its most human. And when cycles give way to ambition, time changes character. Act 3, Obsession. Macbeth in the collector's mind. Macbeth is a study in obsession. Time in Macbeth is relentless. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day. Time suffocates. Time advances without mercy. Macbeth would have made a formidable modern watch collector, driven, relentless, never satisfied with good enough. Accuracy, progression, power. But Macbeth's tragedy is misalignment. He tries to control destiny. He tries to accelerate time. Collectors sometimes do the same. Upgrade cycles, specification escalation, perfection chasing. Macbeth teaches us something very uncomfortable. Time does not bend its will to ambition. It simply proceeds relentlessly. A superlative chronometer does not conquer time, it moves with it, cleanly. Act 4, Light. Romeo and Juliet and the sundial. Before mechanical clocks, sundials ruled. Shakespeare constantly references daylight as timekeeper. In Romeo and Juliet, the day is hot. Time is measured by heat, by shadow, by the position of the sun. The sundial is time without mechanics, pure light, pure shadow, no escapement, no mainspring, just the earth turning. Humanity moves from celestial time to regulated time, from shadow to oscillation, from orbit to escapement. A modern mechanical watch, it is an attempt to internalise the sun, to trap daylight inside a balance wheel. But the shift changed something. Celestial time was communal, shared, cosmic, observable. Mechanical time became personal, portable, private. That transition, it's not just technological, it is philosophical, and when time becomes audible, its authority changes again. Act 5, Bells, Julius Caesar and Sonnerie au Passage. In Julius Caesar, the clock half stricken free, public timekeeping had arrived. Church bells, they structured society, they regulated markets, prayer, power. A sonnerie au passage replicates that civic ritual, but on the wrist. The Christopher Ward bell canto, it strikes the hour automatically. Once a bell tower declared time for a day, it declared time for the city. Now a watch announces it for one person. Private luxury has inherited public authority. The sound of the hour, it used to belong to everybody. Now it belongs to the wearer. Time evolves, but the ritual remains. Act 6, Honour and Lineage, Henry IV and Martial Time. In Henry IV, time is tied to honour, to battle, to reputation. Prince Hal must grow into his destiny. Time shapes his identity. Panerai, born of military necessity, embodies that same philosophy. Functional, purpose-built, unromantic, not decorative time, duty-bound time. In both, time is not an accessory, it is responsibility, and responsibility eventually meets its limit. Act 7, Morality, the Sonnets in Sonnet 60. Shakespeare writes, like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. That is the sweeping seconds hand, wave after wave, impulse after impulse. Mechanical watches do not stop morality, they dramatise it. Each oscillation is a heartbeat surrogate. We measure time, we measure what we cannot slow. The sweeping hand is not progress, it is erosion, and it will sweep us aside as effortlessly as it sweeps the dial. That is Shakespearean. And finally, there is dislocation. Act 8, Hamlet, the time is out of joint. In Hamlet, the time is out of joint. This is horological language. Time dislocated, time misaligned. Pair this with a below Marine Star precisionist, a 262 kHz quartz movement, absurdly precise, and yet the irony remains. We chase perfect timekeeping in a world where time was never broken. Hamlet feels disorder, we correct the drift. Both are attempts to restore alignment. Shakespeare never wore a watch, but he understood depth, cycles, obsession, light, bells, and morality. He understood that time is not just a number, it is force. Horology didn't invent time, it refined how we live with it. Perhaps that is a quiet link between Stratford-upon-Avon and Switzerland. We build machines to measure what he measured in verse. And remember, watch collecting isn't logical, but it is horological. Sometimes the watch world, it moves so quickly that people forget to stop and understand what it is they're actually looking at. When Tudor released the 1926 lunar moon phase, a surprising number of reviewers called it a lazy release. Some even dismissed the involvement of J2 as nothing more than lifestyle marketing, and that reaction revealed something much bigger than just this watch. Because J2, he's not a lifestyle model, he is one of the most influential musicians in East Asia, and he's collaborated with Tudor for years now. He was present at the launch of the 1926 line, and he's played a pivotal role in shaping this watch. Imagine someone calling Daniel Craig a lifestyle model in relation to Omega. It would sound absurd, and yet that kind of cultural blindness sometimes appears in Western watch spaces, and it completely misses the point of this watch. The Tudor 1926 lunar moon phase, it's not a lazy release, it's one of the most historically authentic Tudor watches currently being produced and sold. And for collectors who normally wear tool watches, it might actually be the perfect dress watch. Welcome back to Horological. I ordered this watch from my authorised dealer on Tuesday the 17th of February during Lunar New Year, and yes, I had to order it. I had fully expected to walk into the AD and walk out with this watch, but my dealer explained something interesting to me. This watch, it is massive in East Asia. Large quantities of stock had been diverted to mainland China for Lunar New Year, for this watch sells extremely well, and that alone tells you something really important. J2 is a major cultural figure across East Asia, not a lifestyle prop. So I waited a week for a box fresh example directly from Tudor HQ, and that wait only reinforced my sense that this watch had been widely misunderstood in Western watch media. My collection, it needed a dress watch, but I'm fundamentally a tool watch wearer, and this is about as far towards the dress side that I am prepared to go, because the 1926 lunar moon phase, it still provides the reassuring specifications that tool watch collectors appreciate. 100 metres of water resistance, a screw-down crown, a solid steel bracelet, security fold-over clasp. That combination is extremely unusual for a dress-leaning watch. The security clasp in particular is brilliant. It maintains a refined dress aesthetic while providing the reassurance of a tool watch safety system. It is a genuinely clever design solution. This watch was officially released globally on the 25th of September 2025, right before the Mid-Autumn Festival, also known as the Moon Festival, one of the most important holidays in Chinese culture. In 2025, the festival fell on October the 6th. Once you understand that timing, the watch suddenly begins to make sense. This is not just another release, it is a culturally anchored moon phase watch. In that context explains why the watch resonates so strongly in Eastern markets. Tudor actually did this watch a slight disservice with their marketing imagery. The dial is a radial brushed subtle blue silk texture, even Arabic numerals with arrow tip indices at the odd hours, but the moon phase in particular, it looks flat in the official photos, but in real life it is completely different. Under bright lighting, the moon phase reveals subtle brushing variations that bring the complication alive. I discovered this almost by accident. The boutique had a display example that was quite dimly lit, but there was a brighter Omega section nearby, so I sat down there to try the watch on. The staff were they were confused until they saw the dial under the much stronger, brighter lighting. They immediately agreed. The official photography simply does not capture how good this dial looks in real life. The case finishing is excellent. The left side profile, it's not dissimilar to a 5-digit Rolex Yachtmaster. The opposite side maintains that relationship if you can mentally remove the crown guards. It is a classic polished oyster style case. The bezel also reveals a small but thoughtful detail. At first glance it appears completely simple, but in closer inspection there is a polished understep and subtle chamfer. From normal viewing distance you might miss it, but it contributes to the refined dress watch orientation of the watch. The dimensions are extremely well judged. 39mm case diameter, 47mm lug to lug, 21mm lug width. The slightly unusual 21mm lug space, and it actually works very well here. It allows the lugs to sit wider on the wrist, which enhances the dress watch proportions. At just over 130 grams on the bracelet, sized for me, the watch feels solid without becoming heavy. The bracelet tapers from the 21mm end link to 17.5mm at the clasp. It blends effortlessly into the wrist, subtle, quiet, and only in closer inspection do you realise there is something quite special happening here. The bracelet is a 7-link design with alternating brushed and polished sections. It articulates beautifully on the wrist. I have had zero desire to put this watch in a strap, and that says a lot. I have always liked historical 9-link Rolex bracelets. This sits somewhere nicely between that style and the familiar 5-link Jubilee. The tolerances are exactly what you would expect from Tudor. Tight, precise and extremely well executed. The clasp deserves a special mention. It sacrifices any form of micro adjustment in order to maintain a thin, elegant profile. For some collectors that might be a drawback, but the trade-off is understandable. Inside the clasp there are 4 ceramic bearings interacting with machined grooves. The result is an incredibly positive closing action. Putting the watch on feels like cycling a well-maintained bolt-action rifle. 2 incredibly satisfying clicks. It is one of the most satisfying clasps that I have used to date. The dial appears simple at first, but the closer you look, the more subtle finishing techniques emerge. Different brushing directions create varied light play. The Tudor logo is printed but also slightly raised. Dial text is kept to a bare minimum, which is a confident design decision here by Tudor. The hands are interesting too. They're not the razor-sharp Zaratsu polished precision of a Grand Seiko. Instead, they are slightly rounded, which fits the overall aesthetic of the watch perfectly. A clean dial with the moon phase as its centrepiece. Some collectors may view the movement choice as a bit of a downgrade compared to Tudor's modern MT manufactured calibers. And technically speaking, they would be correct, but that misses the historical context here. From the perspective of Tudor's original philosophy, this is actually one of the most authentic Tudor watches that you can currently buy. Let's look at a quick spec slide of this watch. The case material is 316L stainless steel. The case diameter is 39mm. The thickness is 10.1mm. The lug width, 21mm. The lug to lug, 47mm. The movement, it is a caliber T607-9 4Hz. It is a Sellita SW200-1 that Tudor has modified. The power reserve is 38 hours. The crystal, it's a flat sapphire with AR underside only. Water resistance is 100 metres and sized for a 7-inch wrist, it weighs 132 grams. For most of its history, Tudor used reliable third-party movements, robust, serviceable, practical. That approach defined the brand for decades. Modern Tudor divers are everywhere now, but a watch like this, a restrained moon-phase dress piece with tool watch practicality, it's far less common, and that appeals strongly to my contrarian instincts. There is one small criticism. Tudor's website, that explains how to set the moon phase, but it doesn't provide a visual moon phase calendar. Instead, you're directed off-site. Even worse, it's not even a clickable link. So I found myself heading over to FP Journe's website, which is an excellent moon phase setting tool, and that feels like a missed opportunity. Tudor could easily have created their own page and kept owners within their own ecosystem here. Moon phase watches, they're rarely about utility, they're about perspective. A dive watch measures pressure, a chronograph measures events, a moon phase measures something much older, the slow rhythm of time itself. And there is one final layer that makes this watch even more interesting. The number 1926, it's not decorative. It is the year that Tudor was founded by Hans Wilsdorf, which means 2026 marks Tudor's 100th anniversary. So the quietest watch in Tudor's catalogue is also the one carrying the brand's origin story directly in its name and DNA. The Tudor 1926 lunar moon phase, it sits in a very interesting place. It is arguably the most dress-leaning watch in Tudor's catalogue. Yes, the Tudor Royale exists, but the integrated bracelet look, it gives that watch a slightly sportier character. This feels different, more restrained, more classical. It also avoids the anxiety that sometimes comes with wearing a highly recognisable tool watch. Instead, it becomes a quiet daily companion, understated, thoughtful, and slightly poetic. There are no design mismatches here. Everything about the watch feels intentional, and when you view that through the lens of Tudor's history and the cultural timing of the release, the watch begins to make perfect sense, which makes it all the more remarkable that some people chose to call it a lazy release, because the only thing lazy in that conversation was failing to take the time to understand the watch. And remember, watch collecting isn't logical, but it is horological. The Lamborghini Countach, famously difficult to reverse. Drivers sometimes had to sit on the doorsill just to see behind the car.
You can actually drive it while not being in it. And we're off. Developed at the Lamborghini factory. I am in!
Early Koenigseggs had awkward, off-centre pedal boxes, engineering brilliance in paper, but human friction in reality.
This is a homage.
Now horology. We talk endlessly about watches as systems, movements, materials, water resistance, accuracy and finishing, but there's a problem. Watches do not exist in isolation, and the least understood part of the entire system, it is the person wearing it. That's not a metaphor, it's engineering reality, because a watch is never complete until a human enters the loop. Welcome back to Horological. We reduce watches to numbers because numbers feel objective, safe, sensible and defensible, but here's a flaw in that thinking. A watch can be mechanically exceptional and still be a poor overall system once it's actually been worn by a real person, because humans introduce variables that specifications cannot control. Weight tolerance, wrist geometry, sensitivity to thickness, reflection, comfort with visibility, psychological friction. None of those appear in a specification sheet, and yet they define the ownership experience. That is why so many perfect watches end up living in drawers and never getting worn. Not because they failed mechanically, but because the system was misread. Specs work brilliantly up until a point, until they don't. They cannot predict the wearing experience. A watch rated to 300 metres, it doesn't feel safer than one rated to 200 metres, especially if you never go deeper than a swimming pool anyway. A chronometer grade movement, it doesn't improve your day if you already trust the time implicitly. A ceramic bezel, it doesn't matter if glare makes you hesitate before you can read it. This isn't a criticism of engineering, this is real world context. Once a watch crosses the threshold of being good enough, additional excellence, it stops being felt and starts being abstract. At that point, the limiting factor isn't the watch, it's you. Most watch dissatisfaction, it isn't about quality, certainly not nowadays, it's about friction. How a watch sits when you type, how it catches light, how it announces itself, especially in public, or doesn't. How aware you are of it at 3 p.m. These, after a long day at work, it can be sore on the wrist sometimes. These are ergonomic questions, human questions. The answers to these questions don't scale with price. In fact, they often get worse as watches become more ambitious. More mass, more thickness, more shine, more presence. Engineering expression increases while human tolerance remains unchanged. That's not a failure of watches, it's a misunderstanding of systems engineering. Value is one of the most abused words in watch collecting. It's usually treated as a ratio, features divided by price. But real value is behavioural. A watch that you want to wear every day has more value than a watch you feel you should wear. A watch that disappears on the wrist, it often outperforms one that dominates the wrist. And once you recognise that, brand hierarchy starts to lose its grip, not because the brands don't matter, they do, but because personal alignment matters more. This is why experienced collectors often end up with simpler watches over time, not out of resignation, but out of clarity. Here's the core idea, stripped completely clean. Watches aren't systems on their own, they're only complete once a human enters the loop. That loop includes habits, environments, psychology, tolerance, intention, and none of that is universal, which is why copying someone else's perfect watch, that rarely works. You inherit their constraints, not your own. Understanding this, it doesn't make you less serious about watches, it makes you more precise. Once you accept that you are part of the system, specifications stop being answers, they become inputs. Luxury stops being status. It becomes suitability. Accuracy stops being impressive, it becomes invisible. And collecting stops being about optimisation and starts being about alignment. That is why some watches endure, not because they dominate on paper, but because they coexist peacefully with their owners. They don't demand attention, they don't create friction, they don't need justification, they just simply work within the limits of being human. This channel, it's not about declaring winners, it's about understanding systems. And the most important system in watch collecting is the system that includes you. Once you understand that, watches become clearer, choices become calmer, and buyer's remorse, that becomes rarer, hopefully. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like, maybe even a dislike, get in the comments, hit subscribe, and remember, you know what's coming, watch collecting isn't logical, but it is horological. Shakespeare never wore a watch, but once again he understood the forces behind timekeeping better than most collectors ever will. In the first film we explored depth, the moon, obsession, light, bells, honour, morality and drift. But Shakespeare wrote about far more than clocks and cycles. He wrote about power, identity, order, chaos, reputation and the strange human instinct to measure absolutely everything. Horology does not exist outside those forces, it's built inside them. So the story continues. Welcome back to Horological. Act 9, Monsters, Othello and the Seco Arnie. In Othello, Shakespeare describes jealousy as something terrifying. It is a monster begot upon itself. A creature born in the mind, suspicion grows, feeds in imagination, and it eventually becomes real. Collectors understand this process perfectly. Needs appear where none previously existed. More loom, more depth rating, more complications. The Seco Arnie embodies that instinct. Large, aggressive, analogue and digital combined. A watch that almost looks excessive. A watch that does almost everything. A horological monster, if you will. But like Othello's jealousy, the monster exists because we created it. Sometimes watches become extreme because collectors demand the extreme. Act 10, Order, The Taming of the Shrew and the Casio F91W. The Taming of the Shrew explores discipline, a chaotic world forced into structure. The Casio F91W is one of the purest expressions of ordered time ever built. There is no sweep, no interpretation, just digits advancing with perfect obedience. Mechanical watches express time as motion. Digital watches impose time as mathematics. The F91W does not negotiate with time, it enforces it. Act 11, Mercy, The Merchant of Venice and the Omega Seamaster. In The Merchant of Venice, Portia declares, "The quality of mercy is not strained. Mercy cannot be forced, it must flow naturally." The Omega Seamaster refined the dive watch concept into something unmistakably Omega. They did not invent the dive watch, but they did refine it until the design felt inevitable. The helium escape valve, the dial balance, the case geometry, nothing feels strained. The watch just simply works effortlessly, like genuine mercy itself. Act 12, Identity, Twelfth Night and the Tissot PRX. Twelfth Night is Shakespeare's great play of mistaken identity. Characters disguise themselves, roles blur, appearances deceive. The Tissot PRX occupies a similar ambiguity. It looks vintage, yet it's thoroughly modern. It appears luxurious, yet it remains accessible. Integrated bracelet watches exist between categories, sports watch or dress watch. Gerald Genta became the architect of the integrated sports watch, designs that influenced the entire industry, much like Shakespeare influenced the entire English language itself. Influence and imitation appear everywhere.
This is a homage to the first CC8. This is a homage.
Exactly like Twelfth Night, identity shifts depending on perspective. Act 13, Power, Richard III and the Flieger. Richard III begins with the line, "Now is the winter of our discontent." The play examines ambition and the pursuit of power. Flieger watches were born from military necessity, large cases, maximum legibility, and function above decoration. They project highly legible authority, but Shakespeare reminds us of something important. power pursued without restraint eventually collapses. Even the strongest watch design cannot stop time. Act 14, The World. As You Like It and the Casio World Timer. In As You Like It, Shakespeare writes, all the world's a stage. Human life unfolds across locations, roles and shifting circumstances. The Casio World Timer reflects that idea. Multiple time zones, a map of the world on the dial. It reminds the wearer that time is not universal. It's always morning somewhere and night somewhere else. The stage expands and timekeeping expands with it. Act 15, Chaos. King Lear and the Steel Dive Willard Diver.
This is a homage. This is a homage. This is a homage.
King Lear is Shakespeare's greatest storm. Nature becomes hostile. Wind, rain, madness, betrayal. The famous storm scene shows Lear confronting chaos directly. Dive watches exist because nature is unforgiving. Pressure, darkness, isolation. The Willard lineage was built for environments where failure cannot be tolerated. A diver entering deep water, it faces the same truth that Lear discovered in the storm. Nature does not negotiate. Act 16, Legacy. Much Ado About Nothing and the Belova Lunar Pilot. Much Ado About Nothing explores reputation. Characters are judged by what people believe rather than what is actually true. Horology has its own legends. The Belova Lunar Pilot carries one of the most famous. During Apollo 15, astronaut Dave Scott wore a Belova chronograph on the lunar surface after his Omega Speedmaster failed. Whether mythologised or documented, the story changed the watch forever. Reputation became legacy for both models. Exactly as Shakespeare understood, stories reshape reality. Shakespeare never studied horology. He never saw a cannon pinion or a quartz oscillator, but he understood the forces that shape timekeeping, order, power, identity, chaos, reputation. Horology did not invent time, it simply built machines to live alongside it. And perhaps that's the quiet link between Shakespeare and watches. We build instruments to measure seconds. Shakespeare measured the people living inside those seconds. And remember, watch collecting isn't logical, but it is horological. There's a moment in watch collecting that almost nobody talks about. It's not when you buy your first mechanical watch, and it's not when you finally get hold of a Submariner or a Seamaster. It's the moment after that. The moment when those watches stop feeling like decisions and they start feeling like answers that everybody already knows. It's not because they're bad watches, not because they've lost quality, heritage or relevance, but because they became culturally complete. You don't really discover a Submariner anymore, you arrive at it. And when that happens, something interesting occurs. The question changes. It's not what's the best dive watch, but what actually resonates with me now. And that's where this watch lives. Welcome back to Horological. If you've been collecting for any length of time, the path is familiar. Curiosity first, then education, then the Canon, Rolex Submariner, Omega Seamaster, two outstanding watches, two designs that genuinely deserve their status, but they've also become the default. They are the Nike Air Jordans of the watch world, instantly recognisable, culturally reinforced, universally validated. That level of recognition, it carries enormous resonance. And in an earlier video, I described that as Q factor, not popularity, but cultural signal density. How loudly a watch exists in the collective imagination relative to how many people actually own one. By that measure, the Submariner sits right at the peak. Even people who don't care about watches know what it is. And that's powerful, but it also means that for some collectors, the experience becomes finished, not solved, just finished. At that point, you're no longer looking for reassurance. You've already got that. You're looking for intent. And that's exactly why some collectors, they start drifting away from the loudest answers towards quieter ones. It's not because they want to be different, but because they want something that asks more of them. And that's where the Glashütte CQ enters the picture. What's interesting about the CQ is not that it competes with the Submariner or the Seamaster. It doesn't. Really, what's interesting is that it's often cross-shopped with the Blancpain 50 Fathoms, and that only makes sense if you understand resonance theory. The 50 Fathoms has always had a different Q factor shape, lower mass resonance than the Submariner, but far sharper signal density. Fewer people feel it, but the people who do, they feel it deeply. To some collectors, that narrower resonance, it isn't a drawback, it's the killer feature, and this is where the CQ becomes genuinely interesting, because it occupies the same Q factor space as the Blancpain 50 Fathoms. It's not the same price, not the same history, and not the same execution of design, but the same resonance profile, quiet to the outside world, but meaningful to the people who are tuned into it. Now, before this becomes too abstract, let's ground it for a moment. Let's look at a quick spec slide of this watch. The case material is 316L stainless steel. The case diameter is 43.2mm. The thickness, 15.65mm. The lug width, 21mm. The lug to lug, 51.5mm. And the movement, it's an in-house 3613 calibre running at 4 Hz. Power reserve is 100 hours. Crystal is sapphire double domed with clear AR both sides. Water resistance 300 metres, and sized for a 7-inch wrist. On the OEM bracelet, it weighs 180 grams. The CQ is a modern steel dive watch built in Glashütte. Sapphire crystal, an in-house automatic movement, robust, well finished, properly engineered. On a spec sheet, none of this is dramatic, and that's exactly the point. Nothing here is trying to win an argument. The specs are there to disappear. Once you know the watch is competent, the numbers stop mattering. What takes over instead is feel. And the CQ feels deliberately calm. There's no visual shouting, no exaggerated proportions. There's no need to dominate the wrist. The design is restrained, the finishing is controlled. The way the dial holds light, it's subtle, it doesn't explain itself from across the room, and for someone who's already lived with a Submariner or a Seamaster, that can feel oddly refreshing, because you're no longer buying validation, you're buying coherence. This isn't about German watches being better than Swiss ones, it's about priorities. German watchmaking historically, it tends to value clarity, process and long-term correctness. The CQ feels like a watch designed to make sense over years rather than minutes. It's not trying to charm you instantly, it's trying to remain quietly convincing, and that's a very specific design philosophy, and it won't appeal to everyone, which is exactly why it appeals to the right people. This is also why the CQ and the 50 Fathoms, they keep ending up in the same mental shortlist, not because they look alike, and it's not because one replaces the other, but because they resonate at the same frequency. They attract collectors who are no longer asking, what's the best dive watch? But instead, what kind of dive watch actually fits how I think? And that's a very different question, and it's one that only emerges after the obvious answers stop being interesting. In the previous video on quartz accuracy, I talked about the moment when precision stops being impressive and it starts to become invisible. And this is the same idea, it's just applied differently. Once a watch is accurate enough, accuracy fades into the background. Once a dive watch is capable enough, capability, it fades into the background, and what's left is intent. And the CQ is a watch built almost entirely around intent. This watch won't impress your neighbour, it won't win spec sheet debates and comment sections, and it won't explain itself to somebody who only half cares. But if you're the kind of collector who's already resolved the mainstream questions, that can be a strength, because at that stage, you're not really collecting watches anymore, you're collecting at a much deeper level. And that's why this watch matters on this channel, because this channel isn't about chasing the loudest opinions or ranking the most obvious answers. It's about understanding why collectors move the way they do once surface level questions are fully resolved. Whether that's quartz versus mechanical, Submariner versus Seamaster, or mass resonance versus selective resonance, at some point the metrics stop being the point and the thinking takes over. The Glashütte CQ isn't a rebel watch, and it isn't a flex. It's what happens when the noise drops away and the collecting journey starts to slow down. When the watch in your wrist isn't there to prove anything, only to make sense to you. And if that sounds familiar, you're probably exactly who this watch was built for. And remember, watch collecting isn't logical, but it is horological. Before we begin, full transparency, YouTube will show a paid promotion disclosure on this video, and that is there because I have been invited onto the guest list for this event. I've not been paid to make this video, and no brand has sponsored it, and no company has seen or approved a script, but I think it's important to disclose that cleanly and clearly, because transparency matters. Now, with that said, something interesting is happening in Scotland's watch community. Last year, a brand new watch show appeared in Glasgow. It was the inaugural event, and the location was, well, let's just say it was a little bit unusual. It took place underneath the railway bridge beside Glasgow Central Railway Station. Locally, that bridge is known as the Hailerman's Umbrella. If you know Glasgow, you know exactly the place I'm talking about. Stone arches, trains rumbling overhead, one of the most atmospheric corners of the city, and inside those arches, something unexpected happened. A watch show. Collectors, independent brands and enthusiasts all in the one room for a day of watches, and it worked. It worked so well that the show quickly outgrew the railway arches, because this year it's moving somewhere bigger. Somewhere much bigger, Hampden Park, Scotland's national football stadium. Welcome back to Horological. The inaugural event last year was the first gathering organised by the Watch Collectors Club, run by Hamish and Ed. Great guys, the largest club for watch enthusiasts in the UK, and the concept was simple: bring together watch enthusiasts, collectors and independent brands. Not a luxury trade show, not velvet ropes and corporate exhibitions, no red carpets, just watches and the people who enjoy them. talking to the people who design them and build them and market them. The venue choice was also very Glasgow, underneath the railway bridge beside Central Station, the Hielermans Umbrella historically. This was where Highlanders arriving by train would gather beneath the arches, sheltering from the daily Glasgow rainstorm. Today it remains one of the city's most recognisable meeting points. Dark stone arched brickwork, trains overhead, and inside those arches the first show happened. Collectors and brands sharing the same space. Watches on wrists, not just behind glass. For the first event the response was remarkable. Collectors travelled from across Scotland and across the UK, and very quickly the organisers realised something. They had created a problem, a very good problem. The show had already outgrown its venue. Success forces growth, and this year the event moved to Hampden Park. For anyone outside Scotland, Hampden isn't just a football stadium, it is Scotland's national stadium. Cup finals, international matches, over a century of sporting history, and now for one day it becomes a watch show. That move alone tells you how quickly this event has grown. A gathering that began beneath a railway bridge now needs a national stadium, and that says a great deal about the momentum behind it and the enthusiasm for watches in Scotland as a whole. The exhibitor list is genuinely impressive. Some of the most interesting independent watch brands will be present. One that many collectors will be excited to see in person is Anardane. Based in Glasgow, Anardane has become famous for its fired vitreous enamel dials. These dials are not simply printed, they are created by firing powdered glass onto metal at extremely high, consistent temperatures. The result is a dial that behaves almost like glass. Light moves differently across it. Colours have a depth that photographs just cannot capture. Seeing one in person is really something special. Another exhibitor is Bamford, London. Originally known for modifying luxury watches, Bamford now produces its own distinctive designs. Events like this are often where brands quietly hint at future direction, so it'll be interesting to see what they bring to the show. Engineering-focused collectors will also want to look closely at Formex. Formex has built a strong reputation for innovative case engineering and design, excellent finishing, remarkable value for money. Their suspension case technology in particular is something you really need to experience on the wrist. The exhibitor list continues with a wide range of enthusiast favourites, including Baltic. Baltic is a French independent watch brand. They are known for producing vintage-inspired mechanical watches. They draw heavily from mid-20th century design. Baltic combines classic proportions, domed crystals and textured dials with modern mechanical movements. Christopher Ward, they are a British company that designs its watches in the United Kingdom while producing them in Switzerland. Since its founding in 2004, the brand has built a reputation for offering high quality Swiss-made watches at relatively accessible prices and has developed several in-house mechanical movements. Fairer is a British watch brand recognised for its distinctive colour palettes and contemporary design language. The company combines Swiss mechanical movements with bold dial colours, unusual textures and carefully considered case proportions. Furlan Mari is an independent watch brand focusing and combining traditional watch design and modern production techniques. The brand first gained attention and traction for chronographs inspired by mid-century watchmaking, and it continues to produce watches that reflect classic horological aesthetics. Nodus is a Los Angeles-based watch brand, and they are known for producing robust tool watches that are designed for everyday use. The company focuses on durability, strong specifications and enthusiast-driven designs, while assembling its watches fully in the United States. Vario is a Singapore-based independent watch brand that produces watches inspired by historical and military design influences. The company is also well known for its high quality watch straps and enthusiast focused watch accessories. And through James Porter and Sons, a local Glasgow watch shop based in the Argyle Arcade, visitors will be able to see watches from Nomos. Nomos Glashütte is a German watch manufacturer based in the historical watchmaking town of Glashütte. The brand is known for its clean Bauhaus-inspired design language and for producing a large proportion of its mechanical movements in-house. Zinn is a German watch company recognised for producing highly engineered tool watches designed for professional use. The brand is known for developing specialised technologies such as oil-filled cases, temperature-resistant movements and hardened steel surfaces. Awake is a French-based watch brand that focuses on contemporary design and environmentally conscious production. The company emphasises sustainable materials, innovative dial designs and modern aesthetics while using mechanical movements. Alongside these headliners, there will also be dozens of other brands present, including Abinger. Abinger is a British-based micro brand and they focus on producing well-built mechanical watches that combine traditional design cues with modern manufacturing techniques. The brand emphasises solid construction, reliable movements and practical everyday wearability. Adley is an independent watch brand that blends contemporary styling with classical watchmaking influences. The company focuses on creating distinctive mechanical watches designed to balance modern aesthetics with practical usability. Alfaro is a modern watch brand centred in minimalist design and accessible mechanical watchmaking. Their watches emphasise clean dial layouts, balanced proportions and strong value for enthusiasts entering the mechanical watch collecting space. APR is an independent watch brand that focuses on combining modern design with technical detailing. The company produces watches aimed at enthusiasts who appreciate emerging independent watchmakers and contemporary styling. Ball Watch Company traces its origins to American railroad timekeeping in the late 19th century. Today the brand produces Swiss-made watches known for their rugged construction, chronometer-grade accuracy and distinctive micro-gas tube illumination. Braver is a Swedish watch brand inspired by cycling culture and Scandinavian design. This is right up my street here. The company produces watches that combine sporty aesthetics, distinctive colour palettes and Swiss mechanical movements. Circular is a German watch brand with historical roots dating back to the mid-20th century. The modern company produces mechanical watches inspired by traditional tool watch designs and German engineering principles. Clemens is a British micro brand producing mechanical watches in extremely small production runs. The brand focuses on strong case finishing, thoughtful proportions and classic design aimed at enthusiast collectors. Duckworth Prestex is a revived historical British watch name producing modern mechanical watches that are inspired by vintage military and dress designs. The brand combines traditional styling with contemporary watchmaking techniques. Elliott Brown is a British watch manufacturer known for producing extremely robust tool watches designed for demanding environments. Their watches are built for durability and reliability, often tested to professional and military standards. Epos is a Swiss watchmaker specialising in traditional mechanical watchmaking. The brand produces watches featuring skeletonized movements, regulator displays and classical horological complication. Favre-Lübbe is one of the oldest names in Swiss watchmaking, with a history dating back to the 18th century. The brand has long been associated with exploration watches designed for mountaineering and adventure. Golby Golby is an independent watch brand producing mechanical watches that focus on solid construction and contemporary design. The company aims to deliver enthusiast-grade watches with strong specifications and distinctive styling. Horology. Horology is a Swiss independent watch manufacturer, and they are recognised for developing their own in-house mechanical movements. The brand focuses on advanced engineering, modern materials and innovative complications. Marlowe. Marlowe Watch Company is a British brand that's inspired by exploration, engineering and scientific discovery. Their watches often reference industrial machinery, aerospace engineering and historical technological achievement. Pollen. Pollen is a Glasgow-based watch brand and sister company to Anna Dane. The brand produces colourful, minimalist watches, combining modern design with Swiss movements and everyday wearability. Timor. Timor is a historical British watch brand originally known for producing military watches during the Second World War. The modern company continues that heritage with mechanical watches inspired by classical military designs. Watchgecko. Watchgecko is a British company that are best known for producing high quality watch straps and accessories for enthusiasts. In recent years, the company has also expanded into producing its own watch collections. It is a broad cross-section of modern watchmaking, micro-brands and independent watchmakers, engineering-focused companies and design-led brands all gathered under one roof. Watch collecting can sometimes feel distant. Boutiques, waiting lists and glass cabinets, but enthusiast events change all that. You can try the watches on, you can speak directly with the people who designed the watches, ask questions, learn details and compare ideas with fellow collectors. And perhaps most importantly, you can meet the people behind the watch brands, because at its best, watch collecting is not about status, it's about curiosity, mechanical engineering, design, history and craftsmanship. Events like this reconnect the hobby with the very community that sustains it. So this year, a watch show that began beneath a railway bridge, it moves to Scotland's National Stadium. That's quite a journey for an event that only began last year. If you're anywhere near Glasgow and you enjoy watches, this could be one of the most interesting enthusiast gatherings of the year. Tickets are on sale now. Links to secure yours are in the description below. Hampden is also a very practical venue. Parking facilities around the stadium, they're excellent, which makes getting there far easier than many city centre venues. And if you need a break during the day, there's also a great cafe in the lower level where you can grab a coffee or a quick snack. Events like this aren't just about the watches, they're about the community that forms around about them. So if you're planning to attend, don't be afraid to come over and say hello. It would be great to meet some of the people who watch my channel. And if you enjoy thoughtful discussions about watches, history, engineering and the culture that surrounds horology, don't forget to subscribe, because the most important part of a watch, it isn't the brand, it's the person wearing it and sometimes the community that forms round about it. And remember, watch collecting isn't logical, but it is horological. Rolex get everything right, and that might just be the problem. Perfect proportions, perfect balance, a design refined over decades. This is the Rolex GMT Master 2 126710 BLRO. The Pepsi. For many collectors, this is not just a good watch, it is the answer. And on paper, it probably is. So explain this. Why do I keep reaching for this instead? The Panerai Palm 1661? Because on paper, this shouldn't even be a conversation. Welcome back to Horological. There is a belief in watch collecting that if you buy the right watch, the feeling will follow. And the Rolex GMT Master 2, it is about as right as it gets. It is versatile, recognisable, and it's technically excellent. Let's look at a quick spec slide of this watch. The case material is 904L stainless steel. The case diameter 40mm. The thickness 12.1mm. The lug width 20mm. The lug to lug 48mm. And the movement, it's a Rolex caliber 3285. Power reserve is 70 hours. The crystal is a flat sapphire with AR only under the Cyclops. Water resistance is 100 metres, and the weight on the OEM Jubilee bracelet, size for a 7-inch wrist, is 142 grams. It wears well, it photographs well, and it's respected almost everywhere. You're not supposed to regret this watch, you're supposed to settle into it. So I did what most collectors do, I followed the logic. And to be clear, there is nothing wrong with this watch. The movement is precise, the case proportions are refined, the bracelet is exceptional, everything about it feels considered, deliberate, safe. It is the kind of watch that disappears on the wrist in the best possible way. It integrates into your life without any friction. And that is exactly the point. Because that is also where something interesting happens. When something is this correct, this balanced, this universally agreed upon, it leaves very little room for tension, very little room for personality. You don't fight the watch, but you also don't feel it. And that's not a flaw. It is a design outcome. Rolex has engineered friction completely out of the experience. But friction is often what creates attachment. And then there is this, the Panerai Palm 1661 Carbotech. Let's look at a quick spec slide of this watch. Case material, Carbotech. The case diameter, 44mm. The thickness, 14.5mm. The lug width, 24mm. The lug to lug, 46mm. The movement is a P9010 with hacking, 31 joules, and it runs at 4Hz. The crystal is sapphire domed with AR in the inside only. Water resistance is 300 metres. Power reserve is 72 hours from a twin sequential barrel setup, and the weight on the OEM sailcloth strap is 108 grams. Larger, less restrained, less concerned with being universally liked. This is not a watch designed to disappear. It sits on your wrist with intent. You are aware of it. The case, the dial, the presence, everything about it is more direct. And if you look at it objectively, it shouldn't win. On paper, the Rolex wins easily. Better proportions, more versatile, more refined finishing, more technically impressive. If this was a checklist, there is no debate. On paper is logic, on wrist is truth. On paper the Rolex still wins, but there is one detail that rarely gets discussed: power reserve. The Panerai uses a twin barrel sequential arrangement for power reserve. It's designed to deliver a full 3 days of power, 72 hours, and they feel consistent, stable and predictable. The Rolex also offers a strong reserve on paper, 70 hours, but in real use, something subtle happens. As it approaches the end of that power reserve, timekeeping in the Rolex begins to drift a little bit, not dramatically, but noticeably. In that final portion of the power reserve, it's just not as reliable as the beginning. So in practice, you're not really getting the full figure. You're getting something closer to 60 hours, maybe just over 60 hours of consistent performance. Whereas the Panerai manages to deliver almost all of its power reserve extremely consistently. And it's a small thing, but small things have a way of changing how a watch feels over time, because consistency builds trust, and trust builds connection. because something happens when you wear the Panerai. You notice it, you feel it before you think about it, not in an intrusive way, but in a grounding kind of way. It has a piece unique carbon case, it has scale, it has identity, and it doesn't try to be perfect. It tries to be something else, and that something else is where the connection really starts. So you begin to notice a pattern. You reach for the Rolex when it makes sense, when you want something safe, something correct, something that fits almost every situation. But you reach for the Panerai when you want to feel the watch. And over time, those choices add up until one day you realise something a little bit uncomfortable. The watch that should win isn't the one that you're wearing the most, because better in watch collecting, it is often defined far too narrowly. We measure accuracy, finishing, heritage, resale value, and they're all important in their own way, but none of those things measure connection. None of them explain why one watch stays in the box and another stays in the wrist. The Rolex is designed to be universally right. The Panerai is designed to be specifically right. And they're not the same thing. One is engineered to satisfy everyone, and the other is built to resonate with someone specific. And if that someone specific happens to be you, the outcome changes completely, because there is a hidden risk in buying the perfect watch. When something is universally agreed upon, you stop questioning it, you stop engaging with it, you accept it. And acceptance is not the same thing as connection. Perfection can be passive. Perfection removes resistance, and without resistance, nothing leaves a mark. The Panerai doesn't try to solve everything. It doesn't try to be subtle. It doesn't try to be invisible. It leans into its identity, and that creates friction. But that friction is exactly what makes it memorable, exactly what makes it feel like something tangible. So this is not really a comparison between two watches. That's not what this is. It's a comparison between two ideas. The idea of perfection and the idea of connection. The Rolex represents one of those, and the Panerai represents the other. And depending on what you value, the result changes. So does the Panerai beat the Rolex? Well, on paper, no. In reality, sometimes yes. And that sometimes is enough, because it forces you to confront something simple. The best watch is not always the one that wins the argument. It is the one that wins your wrist. And that is the part that no one tells you. You can buy the perfect watch. You can follow the logic. You can choose the piece that everyone agrees is the correct watch. And it still might not be the one that you wear the most, because watches are not just objects. They are experiences. And sometimes the watch that shouldn't win is the one that stays on your wrist. Maybe better was never the point. Maybe the real question is a lot simpler. Which one do you reach for when no one is watching? And remember, watch collecting isn't logical, but it is horological. I bought the perfect Rolex and I stopped wearing it, and the watch I actually wear cost a fraction of the price. There is a strange assumption in watch collecting that if you buy the right watch, the feeling will follow. The logic is simple. Buy the watch that everyone agrees is perfect and the connection will appear automatically. For many collectors, that watch is the Rolex Submariner. Welcome back to Horological. So I followed the textbook. I owned the Submariner 1140-60, the no date, symmetrical, clean, probably the most universally respected dive watch ever made. And yet I felt nothing. So I assumed that the problem was not the watch, the problem must be me. So I chased something else, not logic, soul. I traded the no date for the Submariner 116610 LV, the Hulk, green ceramic, green dial, a nickname that collectors speak about with near religious reverence. Surely this one could work. Surely this one would connect. But something unexpected happened. The watch that now dominates my wrist time costs a fraction of the price. The Belova Marine Star Precisionist. And the question that leaves us with is a surprisingly uncomfortable one. Why does a watch costing hundreds sometimes feel more alive than a watch costing thousands? On paper, the modern Submariner, it is almost impossible to criticise. Ceramic bezel, oyster case, glide lock clasp, and the Rolex caliber 3135. A movement that has quietly powered one of the most successful watch platforms in history. Everything about it is correct. Everything about it is engineered to the very highest of standards. And yet that perfection creates a strange problem. The watch becomes clinical. It is so refined, so resolved, so universally understood that it begins to feel less like a personal object and more like a universal answer. And human beings rarely connect deeply with universal answers. We connect with imperfection, with quirks, with narrative. There is another layer to this that collectors don't often talk about. The Submariner, it's not just recognisable, it is instantly recognisable. Across a room, across a bar, even across a street, even to people who know nothing about watches, it signals something: value, status, and money. And in the wrong place, at the wrong time, that visibility becomes a liability, because suddenly the watch is not just something you wear, it is something that announces itself, and that changes how you wear it. It introduces hesitation, awareness, risk assessment. Whereas most watches quietly exist in the wrist, the Submariner is always being seen. So when the no date left my collection and the Hulk arrived into it, I expected something to change, and visually it did. The green dial, it catches the light differently. The ceramic bezel has a strange depth to it, and for a moment the excitement is real. But there is a psychological effect that collectors rarely talk about: hedonic adaptation. The brain quickly normalises what once felt extraordinary, and once the novelty fades, what remains is a fundamental question: does this object actually belong on your wrist, or does it simply belong in the hierarchy of watch collecting? Right now, if I look honestly at my own wrist time, the watches leading my collection, they're not the obvious ones. At the top of the list sits the Tudor 1926 moon phase. I'm in a bit of a honeymoon period, a watch that most collectors barely talk about, but the more time I spend with it, the more I realise something important. It isn't trying to win the internet, it is trying to tell a story. The Tudor, it doesn't try to impress me, it just quietly earns its place. Moonphase complications always carry a certain quiet poetry. They remind us that timekeeping once followed the sky rather than the market, and that alone changes the emotional experience of wearing it. But the real surprise in the collection, it's something else entirely. The Belova Marine Star Precisionist, a watch that does something very unusual in modern watch collecting. It removes prestige from the equation entirely, and it replaces it with raw performance. The Precisionist movement, it oscillates at 262 kHz. That's far beyond the frequency of traditional quartz watches, and the result is something that you feel immediately: accuracy. Not theoretical accuracy, not laboratory accuracy, but real world accuracy. In a previous video, I revealed a 6 months test of this. You don't read the accuracy, you feel it. The second hand doesn't tick, it glides. There is a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the machine in your wrist is simply better at its primary task than almost anything else in the room. And that feeling has nothing to do with its price, nothing to do with status. It is simply the feeling of a tool watch doing its job exceptionally well. And strangely, that honesty can sometimes feel more authentic than luxury. And just as importantly, it disappears on wrist. The Tudor, the Belova, they blend. They don't announce themselves. They don't attract unwanted attention. They simply exist as part of your day. And that changes the relationship completely. Shakespeare once wrote something interesting about time. Time is out of joint. Most collectors assume this line refers to chaos, but there is another interpretation of it. It describes the moment when something feels slightly misaligned with reality. A watch that sits in a box rather than on a wrist is time out of joint, because a watch is not meant to exist as stored capital. It is meant to exist as a companion, a device that quietly travels through life alongside you. And if a watch fails that test, its specifications become irrelevant. This leads to an uncomfortable question in modern watch collecting. Is the precision of a machine sometimes more horological than the aura of a brand? The Belova does not pretend to be mythology. It simply measures time extraordinarily well, and there is something refreshing about that. On paper, this is what we're dealing with. Case material, 904L stainless steel. The case diameter, 40mm. Thickness, 12.5mm. Lug width, 20mm. The lug to lug, 48mm. The movement, it's the Rolex in-house caliber, 3135. Power reserve, 48 hours. The crystal, it's flat sapphire with AR only under the Cyclops. Water resistance, 300 metres, and it weighs 153 grams on the OEM bracelet, sized for a 7-inch wrist. The case material, 316L stainless steel. Case diameter, 43mm. Thickness, 12.1mm. Lug width, 22mm. The lug to lug, 50mm. The movement is a high frequency quartz, 262 kHz. The crystal, it's sapphire with AR inside only. Water resistance, 200 metres, and it weighs 155 grams on the OEM bracelet, sized for a 7-inch wrist. When we collect watches, we often think that we are collecting objects, but in reality, we are collecting reflections of ourselves. Every watch tells a small story about what we value: prestige, engineering, narrative, precision. And right now my collection is telling me something very interesting, that a moon phase from Tudor and a high frequency quartz Belova are seeing more daylight than a Rolex Submariner. It's not because the Rolex is bad, far from it, but because the most important part of a watch is not the brand, not the movement, not even the history. It is the person wearing it. So the real question for collectors is surprisingly simple. Look at your wrist right now. Are you wearing that watch because you love it, or because you think you're supposed to? Because the simple truth is, the wrist never lies. Big thanks to the channel members, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And remember, watch collecting isn't logical, but it is horological. I own Rolex Omega Panerai, watches people spend years trying to get, and yet they are not the watches I wear the most. Not even close. In fact, some of the watches that dominate my wrist time cost less than a dinner out. And that creates a problem because in watch collecting we are told something very simple. The best watch in your collection should be the one that you wear the most, but that isn't actually what happens. And once you see why, you start to realise something uncomfortable. You don't wear your best watch, you wear the one that fits your life. Welcome back to Horological. There is a belief in watch collecting, a quiet one, but a powerful one, that if you buy the right watch, everything will align: value, engineering, prestige, emotion, and eventually wrist time. That's the idea, that the perfect watch becomes your default, your daily, your go-to. But if you actually look at real collections, that almost never happens. Let me show you what I mean. I own a Rolex Submariner Hulk, a Rolex GMT Pepsi, an Omega Seamaster, and a Panerai Carbotech. These are watches that people chase, but they are not my most worn watches, not even close, because competing with them are watches like this, the Timex, Casio, Seiko, and Bulova. And here's the uncomfortable truth: these lesser watches often win. So what's going on? Why does a $50 Timex beat a $10,000 Rolex for wrist time? Why does a quartz Bulova quietly take over from mechanical icons? Because you're not choosing between watches, you're choosing between context. Over time I realised something: there isn't one definition of best, but there are layers and they don't point to the same watch. For me it looks like this: importance, connection, usability, security, and wrist time. 5 different metrics, 5 different answers. Let's start with importance. This is what watch collectors think matters the most: value, rarity, brand, engineering. This is where Rolex lives. Omega, Panerai. These are important watches, no doubt, historically, financially, and technically, but importance does not guarantee wear. Then there's connection. It's personal, the watch that means something, a moment, a period of your life, a feeling. Sometimes it's a luxury watch, sometimes it's a cheap watch that you've had for years. Connection doesn't always align with importance. Usability. Now we get to the one that quietly dominates everything. Usability. How easy is it to wear? Can you throw it on without thinking? Does it fit your day, your environment, your routine? This is where watches like Timex, Casio, Seiko, and Bulova start quietly winning, because they remove friction. They don't demand anything from you, they just work. Then there's something that collectors don't like talking about: security. Where you can wear it, how comfortable are you wearing it, and can you relax? Or are you constantly aware of it? Because the reality is this: a Rolex changes your behaviour, a Timex doesn't. And that alone can completely shift what gets worn and what doesn't. And finally, wrist time. This is the only metric that tells the truth. Not what you value, not what you admire, not what you think should win, but what you actually wear day after day without forcing it. Here's where it gets interesting. These layers, they don't line up. They often contradict each other. Your most important watch is not your most wearable watch. Your most wearable watch is not your most meaningful watch. Your favourite watch, that's not your most worn watch. And that all creates tension, because collectors want alignment. We want one watch to do everything, the perfect watch. But what we're really describing, it's convergence, a watch that scores highly on importance, connection, usability, security, and becomes your most worn. But here's the truth: that watch is rare, very rare. Most collectors don't even have one, and even if you find one, it doesn't always stay that way, because your life changes, and when your life changes, what fits it also changes. If you look at your own collection honestly, you'll see it. There will be the watch that you respect, the watch you love, the watch you admire, and then the watch that you actually wear. And they're not all the same. This matters more than people think, because it changes how you buy. If you chase importance, you'll end up with watches that you don't wear. If you chase connection, you might ignore practicality. If you chase usability, you might overlook meaning. But if you understand the layers and how they work with each other, you stop expecting one watch to do everything. And this is where collecting changes. You stop asking, what is the best watch? And you start asking, what role does this watch play? And once you do that, your collection starts to make sense. Because the goal isn't perfection, it's balance. A collection where some watches are important, some are meaningful, some are practical, and a few just quietly take over your wrist. So the next time you look at your collection as a whole, don't ask, what's my best watch? Ask, which watch actually fits my life? Because in the end, that's the watch that's going to win time and time again. And if you've made it this far, I really appreciate that. To everyone supporting the channel through membership, thank you. It genuinely helps me make these videos. And if you enjoy this kind of horological thinking about watches and how we wear them, consider subscribing to the channel. There's a lot more of this in the pipeline. And just remember, watch collecting isn't logical, but it is horological. This is supposed to be the best watch that I own. There is no logical reason not to wear it. It's accurate, it's well built, it's respected everywhere. For most people, this is the answer, and yet I stopped wearing it. Not gradually, not occasionally. I just stopped reaching for it. This is it. This is the watch that should win, and this is what I actually wear instead. And once you see why, you start to realise something uncomfortable. You don't wear your best watch. You wear the one that fits your life. Welcome back to Horological. There is a belief in watch collecting, a very simple one, that if you buy the right watch, everything should align. Engineering, heritage, proportions, reputation, and eventually wrist time. Because why wouldn't it? If something is objectively better, surely you'll choose it more often. That's the assumption, and it sounds completely reasonable until you actually live with the watch. So let's talk about the perfect watch, the Rolex. In my case, the GMT Master 2, the Pepsi BLRO. This is not a compromise watch. This is not a stepping stone. This is the watch that people aim for. It does everything right. The proportions are dialed in. The bracelet is excellent. The movement is robust and accurate. And this is where it gets interesting. It wears well. It looks right. It feels like the end of a long journey. And that's the problem, because when something is this complete, there's nothing left to discover. No friction, no adjustment, no learning curve. It just works. And that sounds like a good thing, but in practice, it removes something that you don't realise matters. Engagement. And still I don't wear it, because watch collecting, it isn't just about owning, it's about interaction. It's about how something feels at 7 AM when you're half awake. It's about how it sits after 10 hours on the wrist. It's about whether you reach for it without thinking, because none of this makes sense. And that's where it breaks down, because perfection, it doesn't always translate to instinct. So what replaces it? Not something objectively better, not something more expensive, something different. Maybe it's a Panerai, maybe it's a Casio, maybe it's something that makes absolutely no sense on paper, but it wins in reality, and that creates tension, because now you have two truths. The Rolex is better, but you don't wear it. There are a few reasons, and none of them are talked about enough. First, friction. The watches we wear the most are rarely the easiest. They're the ones that feel natural. And second, emotional neutrality. The more perfect something is, the harder it is to form a connection, form a bond with it, because it doesn't need anything from you. And then third, there's context. The Rolex works everywhere, but because it works everywhere, it doesn't feel specific anywhere. And still, I don't wear it. So you start doing something strange. You stop choosing based on logic, and you start choosing based on feeling. Not consciously, not deliberately. It just happens. You reach into the box and your hand goes somewhere else. Again. And here's the part that no one says out loud. If the best watch in your collection isn't the one you wear, what exactly did you buy? And again, until one day you realise the best watch hasn't been worn in weeks. And this is where collectors get stuck, because we don't like that outcome. We've been told better watch equals more wrist time. So when that doesn't happen, we assume the problem is us. Maybe we need time to adjust. Maybe we're not appreciating it properly. Maybe we need time to grow into it. But what if that's wrong? What if the problem isn't the watch, and it also isn't you? It's the assumption. Because watches don't compete on paper. They compete on your wrist, in your life, under your routine. And the winner is not the most complete watch. It's the one that disappears into your day. The one that doesn't demand attention, but still gives something back. Once you understand that, your collection changes. You stop chasing perfection. You start noticing behaviour. What do you actually wear? What do you ignore? What do you reach for without thinking? Because that tells you more than any spec sheet ever will. And still, I don't wear it. So yes, the Rolex is better. No argument about that. But it isn't the watch that I wear the most. And that doesn't make it a bad watch. Far from it. It makes it something else. Something complete. Something final. Something that doesn't need me. And maybe that's why I don't need it either. The Rolex is better, but it loses every single day. So let me ask you something. What's the best watch in your collection? And is it actually the one that you wear? And remember, watch collecting isn't logical, but it is horological. This watch should be respected, but it isn't. There's something strange that happens the moment a watch becomes cheaper. People stop respecting it, not because of what it is, but because of what it costs. And the word they use to justify that, homage. But that word, it doesn't mean what people think it means. It's a judgment. And more importantly, it only ever points in one direction, downwards. The cheaper watch is always the homage. The expensive one is always the original, even when that isn't true. Even when the history doesn't support it. Even when the movement inside the cheaper watch is older than the design it's being accused of copying. And once you see that, you start to realise something uncomfortable. We are not judging watches, we are judging price. Welcome back to Horological. There is a belief in watch collecting, a very simple one. Expensive means original. It feels correct, but it only works if you ignore how watches actually evolve, because watches don't appear out of nowhere. They iterate, they borrow, they refine and they standardise. They do it over decades, sometimes generations. So the idea that one brand owns a design language, it's already fragile, but we treat it like fact. Take a watch from Patek Philippe, triple calendar, moon phase, chronograph, balanced dial, symmetrical layout, everything exactly where you expect it. This is a reference point. This is what people see in their head when they think of this complication. And if another watch looks similar, the label appears instantly. Homage, because this didn't start with Patek. Brands like Breitling, Universal Genève were already producing triple calendar chronographs with moon phase layouts, multi-registered dials, decades earlier, and underneath many of those watches was the foundational architecture, the Venus 175. So the layout, the complication stack, the visual language, it already existed. This is where nuance matters. Patek didn't invent the layout, they refined it. They balanced proportion, standardised the dial, elevated finishing and controlled expectation and presentation. And over time, they became the reference, not the original. The reference, and that distinction matters. Now fast forward, you see a watch like this, a Suggest chronograph, triple calendar, moon phase, familiar layout. Inside the Seagull ST1901, a direct descendant of that Venus architecture, and instantly the label appears again. Homage.
This is a homage. This is a homage. This is a homage.
But look at what's actually happening. The movement inside that watch, it is based on a Swiss design from the mid-20th century used in the very watches that defined the category. So mechanically, this watch is not copying something new, it's continuing something old. It is not a shortcut, it is a continuation, and that is exactly where the label falls apart. Because the word homage, it's not applied evenly. When an expensive brand iterates, you hear heritage, inspiration, continuity. When a cheaper brand does the exact same thing, you hear homage, copy, derivative, same behaviour, different language. And that language decides what you're allowed to respect. And it gets worse, because even the movement gets dragged into it. You will hear people say the ST1901 is outdated, old technology, not modern. But that's the point. The entire category is built in that architecture. If this movement is outdated, then so is the history that people claim to respect. You cannot praise vintage chronographs and then criticise the same architecture when it appears in a cheaper watch. That is not technical, that is selective memory. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. That is a narrative adjustment. In Watch YouTube, outdated, it rarely means obsolete. It means inconvenient to the story being told. Because if we applied that same logic consistently, then hand-wound movements are outdated, mechanical watches are outdated, the entire industry is outdated, and clearly that isn't how people think. So we need to redefine the word properly, cleanly, and without bias. Here it is. A homage is not about who did it first, it is about who adopted an existing idea and then made it their own. Under that definition, there are no exceptions. Patek qualifies, Suggest qualifies, every brand in between qualifies, and this is where it becomes unavoidable. If Suggest is a homage brand, then Patek is too. Not as an insult, not as an attack, as a logical consequence, because both are drawing from the same historical template. This is not about copying success. This is about inheriting a language. This is the uncomfortable part. People don't like that idea because it disrupts hierarchy. It blurs the line between luxury and accessible. It forces a different question. Not who did it first, but why do we give credit to one and not the other? And if the answer isn't technical, then what is it? And the answer is simple. We follow the last dominant version, not the first, not the most mechanically faithful, the most culturally reinforced. Patek became the reference, so everything that resembles it gets judged against it. Regardless of history, we are not judging watches, we are judging narrative, just like we were judging price at the beginning of this video. So what is the cheaper watch really? It's not the homage, it's not the copy, it is the version that does not control the narrative. That's the difference. Not engineering, not history, not even design, narrative. In watch collecting, we don't just buy watches, we buy the story that tells us how to feel about them. And the word homage, it's not a description, it is a decision about who is allowed to be original and who isn't. And remember, watch collecting isn't logical, but it is horological. And I'd just like to say a big thanks to the channel members for supporting me to make these videos. And if you're not already subscribed, click the subscribe button, give us a like and get in the comments. See you in the next one. You don't wear your best watch. You already know that. The one that makes the most sense, the one that costs the most, and the one you told yourself would be enough. It sits there, and the watch you actually wear costs less, means less, shouldn't win, but it does every time. Not because it's better, because it's easier, and that creates a problem because it means something is wrong. Not with your watches, with you, because owning a watch and wearing a watch, they're not the same thing. And once you see why, you stop looking at your collection in the same way. You don't have a watch problem, you have this. Welcome back to Horological. Because when I look at this collection, there are watches here that should dominate wrist time. The Omega Seamaster, the Tudor Moonphase, the Panerai, the Rolex pieces, but they don't. Instead, watches like this, a simple Casio, a G-Shock, a Seiko, a Belova Precisionist quietly take over consistently, and that creates contradiction. Because these are not the best watches, but they're the ones that get worn. And that's when something changes. You stop asking, what is the best watch I own? And you start asking, why do I keep choosing this one? Because every watch in your collection, it falls into one of three categories. Category 1, the idea watch. This is the watch you respect, the one that makes sense, is well engineered, it has heritage, carries weight. This is your Rolex, your Omega, your Panerai. These are the watches that you thoroughly believe in, but belief does not guarantee wrist time. And then category 2, the identity watch. This is the watch that you want to be seen wearing. It says something, taste, success, knowledge, belonging. Sometimes this overlaps with luxury, sometimes not. But this watch, it's not about time, it is about signalling. And then category 3, the default watch. This is the one that actually wins the wrist, not because it's better, but because it's easier, comfortable, lightweight, low risk, always ready. This is where Casio, G-Shock, Seiko and Belova, they start to dominate, not emotionally, not intellectually, but practically. And this is where the illusion breaks, because collectors think they are building a collection of watches, but what they are actually building is a collection of decisions that they don't follow through on. Because expensive watches, they come with friction, not physical friction, mental friction. You think about damage, scratches, situational awareness and appropriateness. So instead of reaching for them automatically, you hesitate, and hesitation kills wrist time. Now compare that to something like a simple Casio, a G-Shock, a Seiko Diver. You don't think, you just put it on, and that difference is everything. So the more watches that you add, the worse this gets, because now more choice, more hesitation, more value, more caution, more identity, more pressure, and eventually you stop wearing the watches that you chase the hardest. This is the part people don't like. You are not curating a collection, you are curating versions of yourself, and most of them do not exist in your daily life. That's why a $20 watch can outperform a $10,000 one, not because it's better, but because it fits your reality. So the question changes. It's not what should I buy next, but what do I actually live with? Because the watch you wear the most, it is the most honest watch that you own. So what is the real problem? It's not the watches, it's the gap between who you think you are and how you actually live. You don't have a watch collection, you have a pattern, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. And remember, watch collecting isn't logical, but it is horological. There's something slightly off in watch collecting. The brands that dominate the conversation, they aren't always the brands that built it. Rolex and Omega, they shape perception. They define what people think matters, but every now and then you come across a brand that was there right at the very beginning, helped define the modern dive watch, and were trusted by some of the biggest names in the industry, and yet somehow ended up outside the spotlight. That brand is squally, and once you actually look at what they've done and what they've achieved, you start to realise something uncomfortable. Some of the watches that people call original today, they only look that way because the history has been simplified. Welcome back to Horological. Modern watch collecting, it confuses visibility with importance, but dive watches weren't built in visibility, they were built in failure. Water ingress, legibility loss, timing errors under pressure, and solving those problems didn't happen in boardrooms, it happened in the water. Post-war, recreational diving, it expands rapidly, and suddenly watches need to work, not just exist. Charles von Buren, he wasn't designing for display cases, he was iterating under constraint. Murky water in Lake Neuchâtel, low visibility, real use conditions, that's where things like the high contrast minute hand actually come from. Not style, but survival of function. The centre de plongée Neuchâtel, not a marketing idea, a testing environment with brands like Rolex, Omega, Longines and Squally. Consistent, repeatable, applied testing. This is where dive watches stopped being theoretical and started becoming reliable tool watches. Blancpain didn't go to Squally for branding, they went for cases, because in that era you outsourced to the best in each discipline. If you were serious about dive watches, you went to Charles von Buren. Early Squally designs, they weren't iterative, they were solutions. The double logo system, supplier versus brand identity, the orange minute hand for visibility in low clarity water. This isn't homage, this is original level thinking at its very core.
This is a homage to the first. This is a homage to the first.
And yet today, you'll still hear the word homage, almost always directed downwards, never upwards, even when the timeline doesn't support it, because the uncomfortable reality is this: some of the watches dominating today, they owe more to shared development history than people are willing to admit. Forget marketing, look at procurement. Military units, specialist divers, Dras Galeazzi, Italian police divers, all using Squally. These decisions aren't emotional driven, they're functional, performance per cost, reliability, serviceability, and that's where Squally still lives. So what does that look like in a modern watch? Let's look at a quick spec slide of the Squally Y1545. The case material, 316L stainless steel. Case diameter 40mm, thickness 12.8mm, the lug width 20mm, the lug to lug 48mm, and the movement, it's a Sellita SW200-1 running at 4Hz. Power reserve 41 hours. The crystal is a sapphire double domed with AR underside only. The water resistance is 200 metres. And the weight is 163 grams, sized for a 7-inch wrist on the OEM bracelet. This is what happens when a brand never needed to reinvent itself. The bracelet, screwed links, solid mill clasp, dive extension, no on-the-fly adjustment, because it's not chasing convenience, it's maintaining structure. The bezel, it's undamped, precise, zero nonsense. It's not designed to entertain you, it's designed to time something. The case back finishing is what we'd call in engineering hand-scraped patterning. It increases the surface area and it helps anchor against a wetsuit while also remaining comfortable on bare skin. That's not decorative thinking, that's applied engineering. And the crystal, domed sapphire with underneath AR only, no outer coating to scratch or damage, it's clear in all conditions. And here's the key point, it offers something a lot of the higher end dive watches don't. A traditional domed crystal with date clarity, and that combination, it matters a bit more than people realise. Lume isn't the brightest that I've ever seen, but it's even, consistent and usable, and it does the job. It does the job well. And then this watch, this is where Squally stops explaining itself and it just does its own thing. The 1521 Green Ray. Let's look at a quick spec slide of this watch. The case material, 316L stainless steel. The case diameter, 42mm. Thickness, 12.5mm. The lug width, 20mm, the lug to lug 48mm, and the movement, it's a Sellita SW200-1 running at 4Hz. The power reserve 41 hours. The crystal is a flat sapphire internally domed with AR underside only. The water resistance is 500 metres and it weighs 101 grams on the OEM leather strap. A 500-metre water-resistant dive watch with a 4 o'clock crown position, an internally curved sapphire crystal with AR, a leather strap, fumé green dial with the orange hand. There's nothing here blending in, steeply sloping lugs, on wrist it wears exactly as it measures, there's no surprises here with the wear. So here's the thing, you can buy this watch COSC certified. This isn't that version, but real world testing. So this watch comfortably runs within spec. The 145 that I looked at earlier, that's plus 7 seconds a day. This one's plus 3. It's right on the edge of COSC in some positions, but it's very, very good. It's clear to see that Squally are internally regulating these slight movements in-house. The coin edge bezel in the 1521. It has zero backplay, printed dial, clean execution. There's nothing wasted here. It is a fantastic watch, no doubts about that. There are two ways to make a dive watch. Squally makes both, the Y1545 and the 1521. The Y1545 is 40mm, 200 metres depth, standard Swiss automatic. It looks exactly how you expect a dive watch to look, because that design language, it is the foundation, a language that Charles von Buren helped shape. Clean dial, clear bezel, balanced proportions, the blueprint. The 1521, that is 42mm, 500 metres depth rated. The same movement family, but everything else about it feels different. The 1521 follows a design language that Squally pioneered and kept for itself. That case, that crown position, that profile, and the crystal matters. Flattened top, but domed underneath. So underwater, it magnifies. Not for effect, for function. This is a pure dive tool watch. No compromise, no excess, just execution pushed further, and yet mechanically nothing changes. Steel case, sapphire crystal, proven automatic movement, no new solution. So the difference isn't engineering, it is intent. Both watches express no nonsense dive tool watch solutions. It's no surprise organisations like Dras Galeazzi and Marina Militare continue to this day to choose Squally as a dive watch partner. The 1521, however, that is something else. 500 metres of capability at this thickness, a standard form factor with a saturation level rating. That's not innovation, that's execution pushed to the limits of the next level. The 1545 is the blueprint, the 1521 is the pure tool. Same foundation, two outcomes, and that's where modern watchmaking lives. Not in invention, but in how far you are willing to push what already works. So here's the real question. If a brand has real history, real use engineering and real value, why isn't it bigger? Because watch collecting, it isn't driven by the truth, it's driven by marketing and visibility. Squally never left the tool watch world behind, while others moved on, more polished, more visible, less functional. Squally stayed exactly where it started, underwater. So between these two watches, for me, the 1545 takes the cup. It's cleaner, more versatile, but both are proper dive watches, no compromises. If you're into watches that actually make sense, consider subscribing to the channel, and if you want to fund the research behind the deeper breakdowns like this, consider joining the channel as a member. And remember, watch collecting isn't logical, but it is horological. There are no original watches, not anymore. And the uncomfortable part is there haven't been for a long time now, because if you took almost any watch being made today and you follow it back far enough, you don't find an origin, you find a chain, a sequence of decisions made, refined and then repeated. And once you see how long that chain really is, you stop asking who made this first, and you start seeing something else, something most collectors never notice, but once you do, you don't really see watches in the same way again, and you start asking something far more uncomfortable. Does that even matter? Because we talk about watches like they come from somewhere, like a brand designed something, created something, invented something, but in reality, most of what we call new is built on problems that were already solved decades ago, sometimes almost perfectly. So if that's true, then what exactly are we calling original? Because the moment that you start pulling in that thread, the entire idea, it starts to unravel. Welcome back to Horological. Take the modern dive watch. We treat it like a category full of innovation, but look closer and you'll see something very different, because the blueprint was already there. The Blancpain 50 fathoms rotating bezel, clear legibility, purpose-built as a professional tool. It wasn't experimenting, it was solving. And once those decisions were made, they didn't need to be made again. Then Rolex arrives. Not with something completely different, but with something refined. The Submariner doesn't reinvent the dive watch, it stabilises it. The bezel action, the case proportions, the tactile feedback, it doesn't change the idea, it locks it in. And then a Mega enters the conversation properly, not first, not early, but decisively. The Seamaster in its modern tool form, it is not a breakthrough, it is a resolution, a fully realised version of something that already existed. Take a Seiko rubber concertina dive strap. That design has existed now for years, and let's face it, you're not going to refine that any further. Also look at the modern Submariner glide lock. I don't really see how that could be resolved any further. It's almost perfect. So now you have 3 of the most important dive watches ever made. And none of them started from nothing. They built on something, refined something and stabilised something. And this doesn't stop with dive watches. It goes far deeper, pardon the pun, into the mechanics themselves. Take the Venus 175, a chronograph movement developed decades ago. Its architecture, its layout and its logic still echoes through mechanical chronographs today, even right now. And yet, when that same architecture appears today in something like a seagull movement, it is dismissed, it is cheap, unrefined and not respected. So how does something go from historically significant to currently disregarded without fundamentally changing? What changed? The movement or the perception? A selection of chronographs, some of them bicompacts, some of them tricompacts, but the shared DNA between them all is immediately obvious. Then you look at field watches and something even stranger appears on the horizon, because these weren't designed for expression, they were designed to specification. Military issued field watches, they followed strict rules. Dial clarity, numeral layout, case size and legibility under pressure. They weren't original by design, they were standardised. Here are examples of dirty dozen field watches made for the British military to a very strict specification, made from many brands but all looking exactly the same. And the same is true for dive watches. Water resistance requirements, bezel functionality, visibility underwater. These constraints didn't create variation, they eliminated it. They forced watches to look the same because they had to work the same in the same conditions. So now you've got dive watches built on a fixed blueprint. You've got chronographs built on inherited architecture. And you've got field watches shaped by strict specification. So where exactly does originality fit into this equation? Because at some point you realise something uncomfortable. The watches that we call original they only look that way because we stopped looking further back. And this is where the shift happens, because in modern watchmaking, engineering is no longer the only differentiator. Presentation is, positioning is, narrative is. For some brands, how the watch is presented matters more than what the watch actually is. Because if the product is already solved, then the only thing left to differentiate is perception. Originality, it hasn't disappeared, but it has moved. It's important, but not in the engineering, but in the storytelling. So the question isn't, is this watch original? Because most of them aren't. The real question is this: why does it feel like it is? Because once you see the chain, once you see how everything connects together, you realise something. Watchmaking didn't stop progressing, it just changed direction, from invention to refinement, from engineering to perception. Because once you see the chain, once you see how everything connects, you realise something. Watchmaking didn't stop progressing, it just changed direction, from invention to refinement, from engineering to perception. And if you're enjoying this kind of thinking, hit the like button, it helps more than you think. And remember, watch collecting, it isn't about finding something new. It's about understanding what was already there. If you want more content that looks at watches differently, subscribe to Horological. And for those of you who are supporting the channel, thank you very much. It genuinely makes this possible. And remember, watch collecting isn't logical, but it is horological. Shakespeare Time, Part 3, Act 17, the final act, time itself. Shakespeare never wore a watch, but by now you probably already suspect something really strange, because over the past arc we have explored something unexpected: depth, cycles, obsession, honour, morality, power, chaos and legacy. 16 acts, 16 ways that human beings have tried to understand time, and yet Shakespeare never described a watch. Not once. Instead, he kept returning to something far more unsettling: our relationship to time itself. And in King John, he writes a line so brutally simple it almost feels modern: I am time's subject, not its master, not its controller. its subject, and that line might be the most horological sentence that Shakespeare ever wrote, because for thousands of years human beings have been trying to do something impossible. We have been trying to measure time. Welcome back to Horological. The first clocks, long before balance wheels, long before mechanical watches, and long before quartz oscillators, human civilization still needed time. Farmers needed it, priests needed it, and kings needed it, and the first society to take time seriously enough to measure it properly was ancient Egypt. The Egyptian world, it ran in cycles. The Nile flooded every year. Fields had to be planted at exactly the right moment. Harvest had to arrive before the waters returned, so the Egyptians divided the day, 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night. 24 hours, not because the sun demanded it, but because agriculture demanded it. Time became a tool of survival, a tool by which civilizations could grow, and to track it the Egyptians built some of the earliest, most rudimentary clocks that humanity ever created. Water clocks, simple stone vessels filled with water. Tiny holes allowed the water to drip slowly out of them at a controlled rate. Inside the vessel, carefully carved markings showed the falling level, and as the water dropped, time revealed itself. No gears, no springs, just gravity and patience. But even these early clocks, they revealed a much deeper truth. They did not control time, they simply watched it pass. The next great timekeeper was the sun. Sundials appeared across the ancient world, a simple vertical rod casting a moving shadow across carved stone. Morning, noon, afternoon, time became visible, but it was still fragile. Clouds could hide it, night could erase it, which meant something deeply profound. For most of human history, time could only be measured for part of the day. Half the day belonged to clocks, the other half belonged to darkness. Then, in medieval Europe, something changed. Monasteries began building mechanical clocks, not for science, for prayer. Monks prayed at fixed intervals throughout the day and night. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers and compline. The clock tower was not an instrument of precision, it was an instrument of discipline. Time became daily structure. Villages organised life around the sound of bells, and suddenly time was no longer local, it was communal. The bell tower did not ask what time it was, it told you what time it was and you obeyed. But the real transformation arrived centuries later, with trains. Before railways, every town kept its own local time. Noon was simply when the sun sat highest above that particular town, which meant every town ran at a slightly different time. 5 minutes here, 8 minutes there, it did not matter until trains arrived. Railways demanded something that the world had never required before: precise, synchronised time. A train leaving one city had to arrive at another city according to the same clock. Suddenly minutes mattered, schedules mattered, and precision mattered. And the solution was railway time. Central clocks synchronised across entire countries. Station clocks became the new authority, large, visible and reliable. If the railway clock said the train left at 9 o'clock, the train left at 9 o'clock. No negotiation, no interpretation, just time to depart. Pocket watches soon became part of that infrastructure. Railway workers were required to carry watches that met strict accuracy standards, regular inspections, synchronisation checks. A watch that drifted could cause catastrophe. And interestingly, some of the most accurate watches in the world at that time, they didn't come from Switzerland, they came from the interior of the United States of America. American railroad watches built by companies like Waltham, Elgin and Hamilton were engineered specifically for railway precision. Tough, legible, highly regulated watches. For many years, their accuracy standards actually ran well ahead of anything Swiss watchmaking could produce, and those companies became part of a wider American timekeeping industry that would eventually connect to General Time and the Westclocks Corporation. A company with a small personal connection in my own life. My mother worked for Westclocks and my aunt ran the Scottish factory office. A quiet reminder that the history of timekeeping, it's not only about the famous inventors or the luxury brands, it's also about the thousands of people who actually built the clocks and assembled the movements. And they kept the industry running. It is a fascinating and slightly forgotten chapter of horological history, one that deserves a full episode all of its own in the future of the channel. But the key point here, it remains simple. For the first time in human history, timekeeping was no longer philosophical, it was operational. Mechanical watches eventually brought that level of precision to the wrist, a tiny balance wheel oscillating back and forth hundreds and hundreds of times every minute, portable time, personal time. But mechanical watches were never perfect. Temperature changed them, gravity changed them, wearing them changed them. Which is why quartz appeared in the 20th century, a vibrating crystal, a distilled product of Pierre Curie's piezoelectric reaction, oscillating thousands of times per second. Suddenly watches became astonishingly accurate, and then something even more extraordinary happened. Atomic clocks. Instead of gears or crystals, time was measured using the behaviour of atoms themselves, the oscillation of cesium atoms to be precise, billions of vibrations every single second, accuracy so precise the clock would barely drift over centuries. Which brings us to this watch, the Casio G-Shock GWM 5610U. At first glance, it looks almost humble, a digital square, simple, practical, but inside it carries something remarkable. It's not the solar cells. Every night while the wearer sleeps, this watch listens for a signal. It receives radio signals broadcast by atomic clocks, signals that contain the most precise time that humanity can currently produce. The watch does not guess, it does not drift, it synchronises quietly, automatically. And in my own collection, this watch, it's got a very specific job. This is my railway clock, the reference watch, the watch that sets every other watch that I own. Mechanical watches, quartz watches, vintage watches, every single one of them eventually gets aligned to this small square instrument, because every collector of mechanical timepieces should own something like this. A reference, a reminder that perfect time exists somewhere beyond the balance wheel. But Shakespeare understood something long before radio signals, long before quartz, long before atomic clocks. Even perfect timekeeping changes nothing. I am time's subject, not its master, not its owner, its subject. The Egyptians knew it. Their clocks could measure the hours, but they could not stop the Nile. The monks knew it. Their bells would organise the order of the day, but they could not extend life. The railway engineers, they knew it too. Their clocks could prevent collisions, but they could not slow down the earth. And atomic clocks, they know it too. They can measure time with unimaginable precision, but they cannot change what time does. Horology did not invent time. It simply built instruments to live beside it. Water clocks, sundials, bell towers and railway clocks, wristwatches, each one a small human attempt to understand something vastly larger than ourselves. And Shakespeare captured that truth in a single sentence: I am time's subject. Perhaps that's the final lesson for every watch collector out there. The watch on your wrist, it does not conquer time. It simply reminds you that you belong to it, and perhaps that is what Shakespeare understood all along. Time is not something that we control, it's something that we pass through, and in the end, every single clock ever built is simply humanity listening to its own footsteps. And remember, watch collecting isn't logical, but it is horological.